More important.
I'm just gonna make us all live. Can you pull it out of your?
Yeah, I just grabbed it.
I didn't want to.
Yeah, you didn't want to put your hand.
Yeah, I didn't. All right, we get you there.
Then I got to know it's on.
And now you're live, and then
tend to wander.
You're fine.
So,
I got you.
okay, yeah. Okay.
Can I see both of your?
Yes. So I've got this one in here.
You're good. I just need to make sure the mic packs are on.
Yes. So one is attached to the belt, and I've got one.
That one's
in my
on.
pocket here.
And then,
Is that
yep,
right?
perfectly fine. And then, can I see that one real quick?
Yes.
Now you're good to go.
And sorry, Chris, I'm speaking for 45 and taking 15 questions. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Or do
If you go a little over, that's fine as well.
Okay. Okay.
No, we'll turn you off though. You're live right now. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome into the Schaumburg Library. We're going to get started. My name is Chris. I'm your Adult Programs Coordinator here at the library. I know there's a lot of teachers in this room. Do I need to get them to do the clappy thing? Oh no, you guys, you got it.
They're saying, I think they're saying they can't hear you.
So my mic is just for Zoom because I'm really loud. The regular room mic would blow your ears out if I was using it. Hi, welcome in. I'm your Adult Programs Coordinator, Chris. Welcome to another Civic Awareness Series. I'm so whoop whoop. I'm so excited to be continuing this series. We have a great program this evening about the Electoral College and the National Popular Vote. I am not the expert in that, so I'm going to turn things over to those experts. But first, a few of our gentle, friendly, in-person and online reminders. Make sure Nope, that was a message for me, and I was worried someone couldn't hear. We're doing great tonight. Anyway, in-person audience, if you need a restroom at any point during the program, restrooms are located straight out this door. Ladies is immediately on the left. Gentlemen's is a little bit further down the wall. There is a water fountain in between both if you need water during the program. All three of these doors are unlocked on both sides, so you can come in and out of whichever door is most convenient to you. If you have questions during the program for our presenter, if you turn your heads in the back, you can see our wonderful friend Marianne holding those beautiful, wonderful, extremely expensive and exciting note cards. So you can write down any question you might have for the speaker. Marianne will collect those questions and bring them to our lovely friend Chris, who will be facilitating the Q&A at the end of the program. If you're online and going, hey, is Marianne going to bring that note card all the way to my house? No, but you have Zoom, and Zoom comes with a Q&A feature, and if you type your questions into the Q&A, you can do that as the program goes. We will address those questions just at the end of the program. Chris is going to have this handy-dandy tablet, so she will see all of your questions, so don't worry, you get to participate in the Q&A as well. If my online audience is having any technical difficulties, make sure to reach out to me directly, again, using that Q&A. I'll also have access to it. That way I'll be able to go back and forth with you more seamlessly to help you with any problem you might be experiencing. And my final point of note is for everyone in the room, if you could take a moment to silence all cell phones and any other electronic device that may make noise during the program. Sounds and lights emitted by these devices are distracting to your fellow patrons as well as the speaker. Now, I've taken up far too much of your time and our speaker's time, so I'm actually going to turn things over to one of my friends from the League of Women Voters, Chris Jesse, who's going to introduce our speaker. Chris, take it away.
Thank you. Good evening to everybody who's joining us. I'm with the League of Women Voters.
Step right there. Now we're good.
I'm with the League of Women Voters, and thank you for the Schaumburg Library for sponsoring this event with us. Today is Women's Equality Day, which commemorates the adoption of the 19th Amendment. For those who are not aware of the 19th Amendment, it prohibits states from denying the right to vote to citizens on the basis of sex. League of Women Voters highlights the efforts of women and men working to achieve full equality for all citizens. I am the co-president of the League of Women Voters of the Palatine, Barrington, and Schaumburg areas, along with Cammie Bassick, who is in the back. I would like to just provide a little bit of information about the League. We are a political, nonpartisan organization whose mission is to increase voter engagement and defend democracy. You may be familiar with some of our programs, like our candidate forums, which are hosted during the election cycle, with voter registration events, and we advocate for issues that are local, state, and national level. We welcome the energy of people of all ages and genders to support our mission. If you're interested in learning more about the League of Women Voters, we do have a membership table at the back that we'd like for you to stop by, and we can get in contact with you if you would like to become a member. Also, you can go to lwvpalatinearea.org and you can join there. Today, I'm going to introduce our speaker. David Faris is a professor of political science at Roosevelt University in Chicago. Professor Faris focuses on American elections and political institutions, foreign policy, and international relations. He was born and raised in New Jersey and earned his PhD in political science at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2020, he published The Kids Are All Left: How Young Voters Will Unite America. Let's hope so. In addition to his academic work, he is a contributing writer for Slate, Newsweek, and The Week. He currently teaches Introduction to American Politics, presidential primaries, and other political science courses. Outside of the classroom, he enjoys writing, hanging out with his kids, seeing a baseball game, and following fantasy baseball teams. Thank you for coming, Dr. Faris. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Can you all hear me okay? Does it sound good? Okay, awesome. Thanks to the Schaumburg Library and to the League of Women Voters for the invitation to speak here tonight. It's my honor to be here with you. And I'm really excited to talk about this subject. I want to explain one thing, and that's my footwear. Why am I in sneakers? That's because my 2-year-old daughter literally tore my dress shoes apart about a week ago. And I bought new ones, and then I left them at school. Because I take a train to school, and then I walk from the train, and you got to switch your footwear, and it's constantly tripping me up. But if I get something wrong up here, and if I think my kids are actually wild, it is their fault. Because, sorry, Anish. I haven't had a good night's sleep in 7 years. I have a 7-year-old. So anyway, but I'm going to do my best, okay? I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for questions, Q&A at the end. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And this is a non-partisan presentation, so I'm doing my best to give you both sides of this argument and this debate as best as I can reconstruct all those positions, okay? So we're going to get to the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. But first, of course, I want to talk about the Electoral College and what it was for and how it came about. If I can get these buttons right, there we go. So, of course, this is the map of the 2024 presidential election based on how the election went in November of 2024. The basic operation of the Electoral College is deceptively simple for such a strangely named institution. Okay, the way that you calculate the number of electors that a state has is you simply take the number of House seats that it's assigned in the US House of Representatives, and then you add that state's 2 senators, and all the states get 2 senators. Washington, D.C. is a unique case where it does have Electoral College votes, but of course does not have members of the House of Representatives or voting members of the House of Representatives or any senators, right? So DC was given electoral votes by amending the US Constitution. Okay, so the total number of electors is 538. For many years, one of the leading political sites in this country was called 538.com, which was Nate Silver's site. That's where he got the idea to name his website. And to become the president of the United States, you need a majority of these electoral college votes, totaling 270 or more. Of course, there are countless paths to 270 for any candidate, right? So a lot of what political scientists do now is calculate what those paths might look like and who's ahead in each state and all that stuff. But there's a couple of exceptions to the general trend of states awarding all of their electors to the popular vote winner of their state. Okay? Those 2 exceptions are Maine and Nebraska, which split their electoral votes. They both award 2 electors to the statewide winner, and then they award 1 elector to the winner of each of their congressional districts. Does that make sense? So it's interesting that we don't, not all of the states do this exactly the same way. And we will get to why that is in the sort of interesting constitutional context of why the states are allowed to kind of make up their own rules about how these electors get appointed in the first place. Okay. So moving along. The way that the Electoral College works is usually pretty straightforward, okay? With a couple of exceptions in American history, somebody has gotten a majority of the Electoral College votes, and that's that, okay? But the nature of the institution invites a variety of odd little scenarios that could transpire if nobody gets 270, right? One of them is the dreaded 269 tie, in which the 2 candidates are deadlocked. And in that case, the election ends up in the House of Representatives. Okay, like the framers of the Constitution actually expected that that's how it would usually work. When they finished the thing, they of course, famously did not foresee the role that political parties would play in our political system, but they also anticipated, for a variety of reasons, that there would be a bunch of candidates drawing Electoral College votes, not just two, and that they would split the votes so significantly that the House of Representatives, more often than not, would end up be the institution that picks the president. Okay, it hasn't happened in a long time. Okay, but there have been cases in American history where more than two people get electoral votes after the election. The last spring, this does feel like 100,000 years ago at this point, but in the spring of 2024, remember the spring of 2024? This guy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., was polling as high as 20% in many opinion polls, and it was plausible, not likely, but plausible, that he could actually win electoral votes, and then in a close election, prevent either candidate from getting 270 and thus throwing the election to the House, which is something that, of course, has not happened in anybody's living memory in this country. There's a variety of like kind of even more odd scenarios, and that is if the House is tied. Okay, so if nobody gets 270 and the election goes to the House, interestingly, it's not a straight up vote of all 435 members of the House. It's a vote, each congressional delegation gets one vote. I don't think this is the best idea, okay, but this is what's in the Constitution, right? So in other words, there would be 50 votes, and you could see a scenario where it's 25 to 25, right? So you get a 269 tie or something like that, and then you get a tie in the House, and then, like, to be honest, like, all hell breaks loose, okay? The vice president serves as the president until the House chooses a Senate, if the Senate is unable to make a decision there. So. We don't want any of those things to happen. Like, even I think the people that designed the system would look at this and be like, that seems not ideal for a variety of reasons. And luckily, I think we're very lucky that nothing this odd has ever really happened in our history. And it becomes a kind of a thing that we talk about in presentations and think about something happening in theory that doesn't typically happen. Okay, in almost every single presidential election in American history, one person has won a majority of the Electoral College votes. And that's that, okay? And there's not a lot of dispute about it. So why do we have this thing, okay? I'm a college professor, okay? And I find one of the hardest things to explain to an 18-year-old who has not thought about this very often is like what on earth this institution is, like where it came from, why we don't just elect the president with a simple majority of all the votes cast in the country. And that story takes us all the way back to the Constitutional Convention in the city that I grew up outside of in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Okay, they left this to the end, right? The convention met starting in May and it went through August, okay? This was before air conditioning. And all these people were locked in like a hot, sweaty room in a Philadelphia summer, which is actually my personal nightmare situation. So they're locked in this hot, sweaty room and they came to all these agreements and disagreements about the convention. And by the time they were ready to pack up and go home, they still had not decided how we would pick this new institution of the president, okay? And they took a break. They went on a week-long vacation and they kicked it to a committee. The Committee on Unfinished Parts, I believe, is what the committee that wrote the Electoral College was called. And of course, even in the committee, tasked specifically with bringing the Constitutional Convention to a close by deciding how to pick the president, there were disagreements there and they couldn't come to an agreement about how to do it. There were a few primary ideas, okay? Probably the most popular in terms of the people who were in the room was to have Congress pick the president, right? Having Congress pick the president would be much closer to the parliamentary systems that most of the delegates to the convention were familiar with, including the United Kingdom, where in the UK, if you're not familiar with it, the Prime Minister of the UK is a sitting member of the House of Commons and typically represents the largest party in the House of Commons. So this would have actually given, they probably wouldn't have used the word, but this would have made the US a parliamentary system. Okay? And there were some people that did not want that for some obvious reasons, right? Like you rebel against your parents, right? But they also, they were very attached to the idea of the separation of powers, okay? And so if Congress picked the president as a matter of routine, it's like, well, how independent is Congress and the president at the end of the day, right? There was worries that the president would, to get reelected, just do whatever Congress wanted or curry favor with Congress, or worries about corruption if Congress to pick the president. Another major idea, of course, was a direct election, which is what a lot of people want today, and we'll get to that later. That was pushed by a guy named Governor Morris of Pennsylvania. And there was significant opposition to both of these ideas. Okay? The most significant opposition came from states in the US South. Seeing some of the compromises that were made to get the Constitution written, the leaders of those states worried that because the slave population of those states was not being counted fully towards their population count, that they would be disadvantaged in a direct popular vote election, or they were worried that they would lose their primacy in the American political system, okay? Or they would be outflanked by the free states. Contrary to popular belief, slavery was not actually the most important contributor to adopting this system. It was one of a number of different variables. But I always like to point out that this was a last-minute compromise. And I think if you had pigeonholed the members of the Committee on Unfinished Parts, none of them would have said, like, I think we came up with like the most awesome idea that in the whole Constitution, this is excellent. This is a well thought out idea, let's roll with it, we're really confident in this. They probably would have said like, I'm really hot and I don't have any clothes left, right? Like, I've sweated through all of my clothes and my wigs and I gotta go home. And it was 1770, like we only have like 10 days left to live anyway. So they were tired, they were running out of time. And they believed with some reason that the system that they designed would end up having the elections decided in the US House of Representatives, which at the end of the day, they did manage to make themselves comfortable with. One of the interesting objections to a direct election of the president at the time was that people were worried that people wouldn't know enough about the various candidates to be able to make an informed decision. You think about like what was going on in the world at this time. Like there were no trains and no cars. Like people were relatively isolated. It was already a large country, and people were worried. Is a random farmer in South Carolina going to know anything about like the governor of Maine, right? And their thinking was no. They anticipated that each state would probably vote for like their own person, and then Congress would and the House would figure it out. So they figured like somebody in South Carolina, there'd be a candidate that appealed to people in South Carolina and only to people in South Carolina. They would get some electoral votes. And then the House, like the more informed group of people, according to the framers, they would hash that out and pick the president. Okay. Obviously, that's not what happened. I don't recommend asking the current iteration of Google to give you a picture of Alexander Hamilton. Google's Gemini makes some mistakes. I don't know if you've ever experimented with that before, but it's really something. Okay, so anyway, how did this new system work? Not that well, okay? For one thing, they had to amend the Constitution almost immediately with the 12th Amendment to prevent the situation. The way that the Electoral College was originally designed is that the president was the person with the most electoral votes, and then the vice president was the runner-up. So like, imagine if Kamala Harris was serving as Donald Trump's vice president right now, right? Like that was the original system design of the US Constitution. And I think, I don't wanna, I think we can all agree that'd be a bad idea, right? Like nobody would enjoy that. So they amended the Constitution to have the electors cast separate votes for the president and the vice president. But interestingly, it wasn't until like decades after the Constitution was written and ratified that most states adopted the practice of awarding their electors via a direct popular vote of all eligible voters in their state. Of course, in 1836, there were many fewer eligible voters than there are now, right? But in the early 1800s, mostly it was state legislatures that chose the electors of their state. And it wasn't, this happened over time as some states gradually adopted the practice of having the voters pick the electors. That became too enticing of an idea to deny to other states, right? Like our conception of democracy evolved over the course of the 19th century such that it would have struck people as pretty absurd in like 1880 for the state legislatures to just be like, I don't care what people said, we're just gonna pick this guy, right? There was an expectation that the electors would reflect what the voters of that state wanted, okay? And that again, that didn't happen right away. There's another problem with the Electoral College, which is that electors are actual human beings who, in some cases, do not actually vote for the person that they are pledged to vote for. These are called faithless electors. The Supreme Court in the summer of 2020 actually ruled that states do have the ability, they have the right to bind the electors into voting for the person that they are pledged to, but the Supreme Court stopped short of requiring it. Right? So they said, like, this is up to the states. If the states want to if the states want to effectively make the concept of faithless electors illegal, they can do so, but we're not going to do it for them. There have been, I believe, 90 instances of faithless electors in American history. 10 of them came in the 2016 election alone. There was both an active effort to get electors not to vote for Donald Trump, and then for whatever reason, like a bunch of Hillary Clinton's electors were like, well, everything is a mess anyway, I'm just gonna vote for Bernie Sanders or whoever, right? Like, there were some interesting choices made in the 2016 election. This is a map that depicts state law about faithless electors by the state, okay? And so the only states that don't have any laws binding electors are in gray. Interestingly, there are some states that like allow you to be a faithless elector, but then they like impose some kind of punishment on you. Doesn't seem like the best idea to me. And then there's a bunch of states that simply prevent it from happening at all, right? You are not in one of them. So anyway, again, I can't emphasize enough, like Soylent Green, electors are people, right? This institution is not a dead man's hand, right? It doesn't just happen by virtue of the election machinery, right? The political parties in every state select their own electors. They select a slate of electors. So in Illinois, the Democratic and Republican parties will pick a number of human beings equal to the number of electors in that state, and they will vet them to make sure that they are like dedicated party loyalists who won't become faithless electors, right? That's what you want. So it's oftentimes it can be local and state officials, it can be longtime party members, party supporters, but it's not just like a random person on the street. Like the parties go to great lengths to ensure that the electors that they choose are committed to the party that they say that they are committed to, okay? And then there's this whole process that everyone became intimately familiar with in 2020 in terms of the machinery of what happens. Like most people, in most elections, most people stop paying attention after CNN is like, this is the president, right? Most people are like, sounds good, back to work. But there's a whole series of things that happen afterwards. The electors gather in their respective state capitals. In 2024, that was on December 17th. They cast their ballots officially. And then someone in each state is responsible for transmitting the official electors to Congress, where they are opened and count. Of course, we already know, like somebody else has already opened and counted them, right? But like there's an official counting in Congress that happens to certify the election, and that is what became such a hot button thing in 2020 when that process was interrupted by the mob outside the Capitol, and then there were a number of members of Congress that were objecting to the outcomes. Those things are governed by the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which, interestingly, I don't know if you followed this, but they did revise that law in 2022 in response to the events of 2020. Right? They wanted to tighten the ship up a little bit. They raised the bar for objecting to the official slate of electors that was sent. They more specifically noted like who gets to send the electors. Okay, prior to 2022, like in theory, anybody could have sent a slate of electors to Congress and forced them to like open the envelope and figure it out. Okay, so they fixed some of the holes in the Electoral Count Act. I wouldn't say that it's airtight, but it's a little bit more airtight than it was in 2020. So a couple of concepts about the Electoral College that I think are important for us to understand how it works, and probably more importantly, why a lot of people object to this institution, okay? One of them is called the tipping point state. Have you heard of this term? Okay. The tipping point state is a concept that is used to calculate something called the Electoral College bias. Okay? I don't mean the Electoral College is like a person that has bias against someone, but like in every single presidential election going back to the founding, the Electoral College has benefited one party or the other. Okay? Mostly it hasn't mattered, because mostly the popular vote winner has been the winner of the Electoral College. But of course, twice this century, that has not been the case. We call that an Electoral College inversion. The tipping point state is the state that provides the decisive 270th vote to the winner. Okay. You don't know in advance what that state is going to be. You can only figure that out when all the votes are counted and the outcome is in. The way that you figure this out, have you ever gone to like Wikipedia and just like tried to organize the states by margin of victory after a presidential election? You click the top and it's like, you start with like, in 2024, the state that Donald Trump won by the most, I don't actually know off the top of my head, but if I had to guess, like Idaho or something, right? Wyoming, a state that he won by 50%. And then you go in a line, right? The winning candidate, you take the biggest margin of victory and you go state by state as the margin of victory decreases, right? Until you get to the state, when you add that state to the tally, it goes over 270. Does that make sense? So in effect, that was the state that decided the election. Of course, they all, in a way, decided the election, okay? But you line up the winner states from largest to smallest margin of victory, and the tipping point state is just the one that gave you 270, okay? Sometimes that can be a tie. But the tipping point state has differed throughout American history. In 2004, it was Ohio. In 2016 and 2020, it was our neighbors to the north in Wisconsin. And then in 2024, as many people predicted in advance, it was Pennsylvania that was the tipping point state. So why is this important, you might ask? This is how we calculate that bias, okay? So the way that you end up with an electoral college inversion, that one candidate winning the electoral college while losing the national popular vote, is that the institution itself ends up post hoc benefiting one party or the other. It's not always Republicans, okay, contrary to popular belief. Barack Obama and both of his victories, like the Electoral College benefited Democrats in 2008 and in 2012, interestingly. It didn't matter, again, but if you calculate the bias, that's what happened. So what we think in political science, okay, is that the margin of victory for the candidates in the states moves fairly reliably with the national margin. Okay? So if a candidate is polling at 48% and there's a scandal and they fall to 45%, our assumption in political science is that they will lose 3 points in roughly every single state. Right? That is called the uniform national swing, and it is why we think there is such a thing as an electoral college bias. And the way that you calculate that is pretty easy, okay? One, you identify the tipping point state, as I just did on the previous slide, and that's just based on publicly available election returns on Wikipedia, and then you subtract the margin of victory in the tipping point state from the national popular vote margin, and then you have the electoral college bias. I think it will help you if I show it to you really quick. Okay, so in 2024, the way that you calculate the electoral college bias is you take the margin in the state of Pennsylvania for Donald Trump, which was 1.71%, and then you subtract the national margin from the tipping point margin. The national margin in 2024 was 1.48%, right? So Donald Trump won the national popular vote. He was the first Republican candidate to win the national popular vote since 2004, and he did so by about a point and a half. And that means that the Electoral College had a very, 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 very small, almost indiscernible Republican bias in 2024 of 0.23%. And that means in all likelihood, right? Like I can't promise you 100%, but in all likelihood, if Kamala Harris had won the national popular vote by 0.2%, she would still have lost the election because she would have lost the tipping point state of Pennsylvania to Donald Trump. Does that make sense? And so as you can see here, where that was the third consecutive presidential election where Republicans benefited from the Electoral College bias, after 3 consecutive elections where Democrats benefited from the Electoral College bias. Little known fact, lost to history, if you remember the 2004 presidential election, John Kerry versus the incumbent George W. Bush, if John Kerry had won an extra, I think 118,000 votes in Ohio, he would still have lost the national popular vote decisively, but he would have become the president. Wow. Because of the Electoral College's the Democratic bias that year. So anyway, the way that this flips back and forth between a bias for the Democrats and the bias for Republicans is like a little bit random and hard to predict in advance. We don't know yet whether the Electoral College will have a Democratic or a Republican bias in 2028. It could go either way. It really depends on shifts in state level preferences among voters, between the two parties, between elections, which we simply cannot predict from the vantage point of 2025. And nobody, to my knowledge, is trying to predict the Electoral College's 2028 bias yet. Does this all make sense? Can I answer any questions about this particular chart? Okay. By bias, I don't mean like, it hates anybody or something, or like prejudiced. It's just like the institution will benefit one of the two parties more than the other. And again, typically the margin of victory in a presidential election throughout American history has been large enough that it doesn't matter. But we live in an era of like extremely close presidential elections. In comparative perspective, the 21st century has been a string of the closest presidential elections in our history. Okay. And there's not really any sign from polling that that's going to change anytime soon. Right? So the dynamics of the Electoral College may very well come into play in 2028, unless something changes, which is certainly possible. I love the story of Harry Truman in 1948, which is remembered as a pretty decisive victory for him, the Democrat. Famously, the newspaper declared Dewey the winner, right? That was a Chicago thing, right? But Harry Truman won the national popular vote by 4.5%. He won the Electoral College like fairly decisively. But if he had lost just half a point from his national margin, he would have actually lost to Thomas Dewey. Right? And history would have been quite a bit different. Okay? So as we're thinking about this institution, there's a fairly standard debate that is held between people that support and want to preserve the Electoral College and people that dislike it and want to abolish it in favor of directly electing the president. Okay? So I'm going to present the arguments that are used against it first, and then I'll get to the arguments that are typically deployed in favor of the Electoral College. Okay? One, I think if you just think about this, that we conduct the system. Right? It does at the state level, but when you calculate national outcomes, some citizens have a little bit more power in the Electoral College than others, depending on where they live. Okay? That's, again, not a Republican or a Democratic bias. It is a small population versus a large population bias. Right? So people in New Hampshire, where my brother lives, have more power, like tons more power, right? But like a little bit more power in electing the president than I do in the state of Illinois. My brother in New Hampshire also is like during the primaries is constantly texting me how he runs into presidential candidates in coffee shops and stuff. And I'm like, I hate you. I would do anything to run into a presidential candidate in a coffee shop, but they don't come here, right? And the reason that they don't come to Illinois is one of the reasons people object to this system, because we are a relatively deep blue state in the red-blue scheme of American politics. Our votes are more or less taken for granted, and we received 0 visits from the presidential candidates in 2024, right? Like 0 in-person visits. So the smaller population states get a little bit more say. This I think, in my humble opinion, is probably the most powerful objection to it, is that the campaigns have to focus all of their attention and money on the most closely divided states politically. Right? So, anywhere from 7 to 12 states receive tons and tons and tons and tons of attention, like a firstborn child or something, and the rest of us are the ones that have to get the hand-me-downs or whatever as the second child. Children are on my mind. So anyway, when the national popular vote winner does not win the election, we call that an Electoral College inversion. It's only happened a handful of times. But it does, we think, create perhaps a legitimacy problem for the president who takes office via a popular vote minority. Okay? There were a lot of writers in America that referred to President Trump with an asterisk from 2017 to 2021 when he took office after losing the popular vote. But of course, that was the system that was in place prior to the election. His victory was legitimate within the parameters of the system, but some people want to change that system to prevent that from happening again. Okay. Of course, in 2000, this was the election that happened the year that I graduated from college. The Democrat Al Gore won the national popular vote very, very narrowly, actually, if you think about it, 500,000 votes out of tens of millions of votes cast. But he lost the Electoral College to George W. Bush in a very controversial and very lengthily litigated election in the state of Florida, which was the decisive state in 2000. So if you calculate this, there are 712,000 people per elector in California and 195,000 people for every elector in Wyoming, which has, just simply has more structural power in the system than California does. This also applies to us in Illinois. We're relatively large, one of the larger states in the country in terms of population. And we have less, you and I and everybody who lives in Illinois has a little bit less structural power to choose the president than somebody in Delaware or New Hampshire or Montana. It's a little bit similar to the situation with the US Senate. In 2024, swing states received 94% of the presidential campaign visits. Right? So the 7 swing states, the consensus swing states last year, which were North Carolina, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, what am I missing? Is it New Hampshire? Anyway, those 7 states got, almost every single campaign visit. And the rest of us got nothing. Now, do I personally get anything out of Kamala Harris visiting Chicago? No, I don't, right? But the reality is, both of those campaigns took us for granted because they looked at polling and saw that the Democrat would win Illinois, even if the Democrat was a deceased dog, as we, as we once said. And that's it, right? The state is functionally uncontested. Every election season, you'll see towards the end of the campaign, one of the candidates will sometimes go to a state that they know they're going to lose to try to draw resources away, or it's like a fake out or whatever. Donald Trump went to New York a couple of times, even though I think even people in Donald Trump's campaign knew that he was not going to win New York, although he did come closer than people thought he would. So people think of this as not great. This is some data that was put together by an organization called Fair Vote, which is a non-partisan organization that's in favor of Electoral College reform, and it's in favor of a variety of other reforms to our political system to make it a little bit more fair. But this puts in really stark relief the way that the system encourages candidates to focus on a small handful of states at the expense of everybody else. Okay? Now, there are arguments to justify this, right? What are they, you might ask? The other thing about we should probably get rid of this thing is that Americans have consistently wanted to get rid of it throughout the 21st century. Okay, the polls have fluctuated here and there, but never once since the year 2000 has anything but at least a simple majority wanted to abolish the Electoral College and elect the president via the national popular vote. Okay? It's just not a simple thing to accomplish, okay, as we'll see in a second. So the arguments, I'm going to skip that. The arguments for the Electoral College, okay, one is that it requires the candidates to find support in different parts of the country. Okay, if you spent your whole life in the United States, you may not realize what an enormous, racially and geographically and ideologically diverse country this is. Okay, and in theory, you wouldn't necessarily want somebody to become president just by winning the East Coast and then walking away and having no support in the rest of the country. That would also not be ideal. It does force candidates to campaign somewhere outside of the consensus largest population centers in the country. In fact, the system that we have in place right now kind of drives candidates away from several of our largest cities, including New York City and Los Angeles, really don't get any attention from the candidates at all. And that is sometimes used as a justification for why we should keep the system as it is. There's sort of an appeal to tradition, right? The Electoral College, for better or for worse, is how we have elected the president. It is part of the American tradition. It's an American institution, and changing it would be extremely disruptive, right? Even if you're in favor of that change, I think you have to recognize that it would be a big, significant, controversial change that may cause some confusion and would have a lot of opposition to pursuing a different way of electing the president. There's a New York Times columnist named Ross Douthat that says it incentivizes political parties to try to break up these regional blocks that they control, to try to create an opening or change the Electoral College map. There's a lot of Democrats right now sitting around looking at the map of the United States and thinking like, man, we got to find another way to 270 here, folks. Like, this is not working very well. We got to flip a state, right? We have to change our message. We have to appeal to people in a state that has traditionally been voting for Republicans if we want to get elected. And some folks think that's a good thing, okay? And the other thing is like, okay, it seems on its face like handing the presidency, the single nationally directed election, that it's the only nationally elected office in the country, and handing that one indirectly elected office to the popular vote loser isn't a great idea. But we are not the only country that awards disproportionate power to one political party or another. Our friends across the pond there in the 2024 national election in the United Kingdom gave the Labour Party 411 seats. That is about 2/3 of the UK Parliament went to a party that won 33% of the vote, okay? And of course, right now, like as we speak, the other parties in the UK are trying to organize to change the electoral system to make it more proportional, right? But the UK's system has operated like relatively unproblematically throughout modern British history. And it's not that the election is typically won by the losers, but that the winners will almost always get this like very strange and large seat bonus, where you get a lot more seats in Parliament than you would thinking based on the percentage of the vote that you win, right? That's a vestige of the single member district plurality system that they use in the UK, which is one of the things that we share with them, okay? But like the takeaway is like, it's not unusual in comparative perspective to have the outcome of a national election not like super duper closely match proportionally what the people wanted, okay? It just depends on the system that you're using. So any questions about that stuff before I move on to the national popular vote interstate compact? Every time I talk about this, I have to look it up to make sure it's not the National Interstate Popular Vote Compact. It's the NPVIC, not the NIPVC. It is however you want to put it, it's a little bit of a mouthful. And people who are pushing for this will typically try to just refer to it as the NPV, the National Popular Vote, and just remove the compact and the interstate from the acronym. Okay. So after the disputed 2000 presidential election, it was the first time in most people's living memory that there had been a dispute or some pushback on the Electoral College and the way it functioned. Okay. The last serious pushback against the Electoral College prior to this was after the 1968 presidential election, which came very, very close to being tipped into the House by third-party candidates in 1968. Democrats in particular were like really incensed about the fact that George W. Bush became president, not just because of the Electoral College inversion, but because of the way that the Florida election was settled by the Supreme Court in ways that not everybody agreed with the reasoning that the court used to make that. So the framework of the NPVIC was put together by actually just a couple of law professors in an article that they first published in 2001. And they were just thinking about workarounds, okay? To abolish the Electoral College and to replace it with a national popular vote would seem to require a constitutional amendment. Okay, the Electoral College is in the Constitution. The language is fairly clear and unambiguous that this is how we do it. And so like a lot of people think if you want to abolish the Electoral College, you have to amend the US Constitution, which requires 2/3 majorities in the House and Senate. And then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And I don't want to give away the ending to Titanic here, folks, but that's not going to happen, right? Because it's extremely unlikely that all of those states that benefit from the extra structural power of the Electoral College are going to willingly give it up in favor of a national popular vote. Okay? I have a pet theory that if Kerry had in fact won the 2004 election as the popular vote loser, that there could have been maybe a bipartisan push to abolish the thing because both parties would have been recently aggrieved and annoyed at the institution and maybe cooperated to abolish it. Outside of that, I think it's highly unlikely that you will get rid of the Electoral College via the constitutional amendment route. So the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is like a workaround, okay? And the way that the workaround works is that state legislatures pass a law that says when states totaling 270 electoral votes have also passed this law, we will give our electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, no matter what happens in our state. Does that make sense? You're sitting in a state that has passed this law. Yeah, sure. So the way that the language of the law reads, it says, in the event that states whose electoral votes total 270 pass this legislation, then this law goes into effect when that happens, right? So it's like it's a kind of a trigger law, right? If you've heard this terminology in reference to the elimination of Roe v. Wade, this is kind of like these laws contain triggers in them that they don't go into effect. Like this is not law until enough states have passed it that you could reverse the outcome of an electoral college inversion. Do you know what I mean? So though if you go and you read the law that Illinois passed, we do not currently give our votes to the winner of the national popular vote no matter what happens here. However, if another 4 or 5 states pass this law, the Illinois statute says we will give our votes to the national popular vote winner no matter what happens. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like it's like a mutual destruction pact, okay? Because it would trigger like a massive constitutional crisis, to be honest with you. But it is the only way that people have figured out how to get around the Electoral College without amending the US Constitution, okay? So the first state, and I was around for this, when they published this article and people started talking about this, it was dismissed as like a comical fantasy, right? People were like, that's a ridiculous idea that will never ever happen. And then over the years, starting in 2007 with the state of Maryland, it has been passed again and again and again. Typically when Democrats have held a trifecta, that is, they control both chambers of the state legislature and the governorship, and one state after another has passed this law to the point where, in some ways, if you think that it will withstand constitutional muster, the end of the Electoral College is actually in sight if the Supreme Court would uphold this thing, which we don't really know whether they would do that or not, okay? This is a map of states that have passed it in green, okay? The organization that's working on this maintains this map, and they update it when a state passes it. So of course, Illinois has passed it, and then the total number, this will actually change after the next census, but the total number of electoral votes of states that have pledged to do this is now 209, right? So they are 61 electoral votes short of possibly triggering a massive constitutional crisis the next time there's an Electoral College inversion, okay? I think I've already sent the library these slides, and you're welcome to have them. The big dispute is like, the math to get to 270 is difficult for proponents of this law. Okay? The reality of how this shakes out in a partisan fashion is that the more Democrats want to eliminate the Electoral College than Republicans. Based on, in my mind, an erroneous assumption that it always benefits Republicans, which does not, and it may not in 2028. This thing has just as high a chance of reversing a Democratic Electoral College inversion as it does reversing a Republican inversion, okay? But there's a great deal of dispute about its constitutionality, okay? Those who believe that the NPV is constitutional will point to the US Constitution and the place in the US Constitution where it says very unambiguously that state legislatures choose the time and the manner of appointing their electors, right? The language is very straightforward. I'll show it to you in a second. It's very straightforward. It's like, the states do this. The state legislatures can pick the electors however they want. And it just so happens that we have decided, that the states have decided to award those electors based on the popular vote. But according to the US Constitution, that doesn't actually have to be how it is, right? According to a textualist reading of the US Constitution, like the state government in Illinois could like wake up tomorrow morning and decide to award our electors in 2028 to Taylor Swift, like no matter what happens, right? Or to like whoever's charting at the top of the Billboard 100, or whatever they want, right? They can pick them however they want. There are those that think that Congress would have to ratify the NPVIC because there's something called the Compact Clause that prevents states from making agreements with one another without the consent of Congress. And interestingly, the Supreme Court has affirmed the right of states to bind their electors to the winner of the national popular vote, the winner of the state popular vote, if they want to. Okay, so this case in 2020, where the Supreme Court said, yes, you can force electors to vote for who they're supposed to vote for, has been taken by proponents of the NPVIC as evidence that the court supports the right of state legislatures to determine like how they want the electors chosen, even if it is reversing the state's outcome. Okay? Does that make sense? So there's some Supreme Court precedent. There's also folks that believe that this is unconstitutional. Okay, there's the problem of the Compact Clause. There's the problem of depriving states of some aspect of their sovereignty, which the courts may reject. Okay? The Compact Clause has typically not been enforced strictly unless it aggrandizes the power of the states against the federal government in ways that the Constitution did not intend. Okay? There's folks that think it might violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And not just that, but it is possible that the MPV could violate state election laws by awarding the electors to the loser of the state vote, right? Like it would be controversial, to say the least. If, for example, like Michigan passed this law, Michigan was the tipping point state, and the NPVIC reversed the outcome in Michigan and awarded the presidency to the person that actually lost Michigan but won the national popular vote, right? Like people in Michigan might be up in arms, and many lawsuits would be filed, right? We are a country where the filing of lawsuits does happen a lot. So this is the relevant language in the US Constitution. Okay, Article 2, Section 1 says each state may appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, right? That, up there in the top left, very unambiguously seems to suggest that the NPVIC would be constitutional, okay? There's the Compact Clause up here. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage. I love the 18th century. Keep troops, ships of war in time of peace, blah, 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 right? But it's very clear, right? Like if the states want to make some elaborate agreement with one another, they need it to be blessed by Congress, right? And that could be enforced by the Supreme Court, right? And then the equal protection of the laws, right? You could make a case that like depriving the voters of a state of the legitimate outcome of the election in their state could theoretically violate the Equal Protection Clause, which was the rationale for why the Supreme Court stopped the Florida recount in 2000 on the pretext that they were using procedures to count the votes that were not being used in other states and thus violated the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, if that all makes sense. So if you go back, and then I promise I will stop talking immediately after the next thing that I say, to get to 270, just given the way American politics are, Democrats would need to take over state legislatures and governorships in Georgia, Virginia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And if those 4 states passed this law, you would get to 270, right? And then if the NPVIC was in place for the next presidential election, right, like in some ways it would be a backstop against the popular vote loser winning the election. In other ways, it would invite a pretty significant crisis because it would for sure end up in front of the Supreme Court, right? Whoever is disadvantaged by this system would say like, I don't like this, we're taking this to the court. And it's, I'll leave it to you to decide what the current iteration of the US Supreme Court would decide about this. But I think you know what I think they would do, right? And so I will leave it there. I know I'm a little bit over time and I want to make sure that you have some time to ask me some questions. So how do you all want me to do this?
I'll ask a few questions, but if
Yes.
anybody has a question.
And I'm happy to stay as long as you all want. So,
Hands. I guess you've gone through this, which I had never even heard of this until today when I started reading about it. Is there another alternative? I mean, League of Women Voters is actually in support of not having the Electoral College.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Or is it on? I can sort of relay your questions, everybody, too, if you want.
Your mic is only for Zoom. I'll get you another mic. Just keep vibing.
Okay. So you heard.
Yeah, so the question is like, is there another alternative? The League of Women Voters like supports abolishing the Electoral College in some way, shape, or form. Is there a way to get there that's not a constitutional amendment or the NPVIC? And the answer is no. Right, like something that's written so tightly into the US Constitution in such an unambiguous way, like the US Senate. There's really not a plausible workaround other than convincing enough people that it should be abolished, that you do it the normal way, which is amending the US Constitution, which has only been done 27 times, right? Or there's this, right? And this, the NPVIC, is the outcome of a lot of anguish about like, wow, we don't like this at all. Is there another way to do this that doesn't require amending the Constitution, because we don't think we have the votes for that? I regretfully have to say that no, I don't think that there's another way to get rid of the Electoral College unless we have a new constitutional convention. Right, and that could happen. It's called an Article 5 convention. If enough states call for a new constitutional convention, it could happen. I don't personally want to live through that. So, I mean, I don't know, I don't know how the League of Women Voters feels about this, but I feel like under present circumstances and present partisan temperatures, having a constitutional convention to rewrite the US Constitution would make the last year feel like stress and anxiety free. You know what I mean? So, I don't know.
I don't know if you can answer a question that's not necessarily related to this, but related to voting. It seems that there's a lot of things happening today that are taking our voting backwards from where we've gone over the last 60 years. Why do you think that is? What do you think is driving this, I would call it kind of conservative views on voting rights?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of reason that that some folks think that voting rights have taken a step backwards over the past 20 years. One of the big ones is a Supreme Court decision that basically invalidated parts of the Voting Rights Act. Okay? Specifically, it invalidated parts of the Voting Rights Act that required certain states of the former Confederacy to have pre-clearance to change their voting rights. They had to go through the DOJ to make changes to their election laws. Right? And by invalidating that, it sort of opened the door for a number of states controlled by the Republican Party to change voting procedures in ways that, like, critics of these changes believe made it harder for minorities or people on the margins to vote by, for example, requiring ID, photo ID to vote. So that Supreme Court decision fundamentally changed the way that the Voting Rights Act was working, right? Voting, interestingly, like the right to vote was really not inscribed in the original Constitution. It has been something that has been expanded gradually over time to include more and more people. And it just so happens that, the current iteration of the Republican Party seems to believe that if everybody votes, it will disadvantage them, right? I don't actually happen to think that that's true based on recent returns, right? But that, I think, is a belief that has taken hold inside the Republican Party. We've had now close to 10 years of like discourse about fraud and undocumented immigrants voting and stuff like this. Things that I think if you consult non-partisan sources, that stuff is extremely rare and not likely to swing a significant election. But those concerns, the concerns are real, right? And interestingly, things like photo ID for voting poll very well with most people. Like, people intuitively think that you should need a photo ID to vote, okay? So that's kind of what's happening. I don't think it's great for our democracy that we're arguing like this about voting procedures, but it's not like illegitimate on its face to require a photo ID to vote, right? It's just like, it's just so, like the people who don't have access to the IDs are overwhelmingly people that vote for Democrats, right? And that's how it's been for a while. So anyway, I'll stop there and just, I'll leave it at that because I don't want to get the library in trouble. So,
Good question.
question? Do we have a question?
Yes,
I can.
we all know who this came from. I've got a good voice. Can you comment on the efforts by some to make DC a state, not a federal district?
Well, I can definitely comment on that, yeah. So DC statehood is a longstanding movement. I actually think that most people that don't pay attention to politics don't know that people in Washington, DC have no voting representation in Congress. Like none. I wrote a book in 2018 that advocated for DC statehood. And as part of writing that book, I went to DC and I interviewed their fake senators. Okay, so DC elects 2 senators that have no voting power and are not like officially part of the body. But when Democrats are in the majority, they'll give them office space. So I interviewed this guy who was like, I'm the senator from DC. Sorry, I forget his name. He was like, I'm the senator from DC. And I was like, are you? I mean, like, are you really the senator from DC? Because you don't have any power. But the underlying logic is like, people in DC should have the right to representation in Congress, the same as the rest of us. Okay? And the way that Congress was written, it excluded DC, it excluded the capital district from that process. So there's some people that think DC should become its own state. It would obviously be one of the smallest states by population, although not the smallest. There's some people that believe that it should be what we call retro-ceded to Maryland. So instead of making DC a state, you would just like give it to the state of Maryland. As like, I don't know, like a birthday present or whatever, and it's like, hey, Wes Moore, guess what? You have like this many more voters. There's some people who think it should go to Virginia. There's different ideas out there about what you should do with the district from a like what we call a small d democratic perspective of like how should democracy work. It's hard to come up with a coherent justification for why these 700,000 people should have no representation in Congress. Okay. I happen to think that what's happening right now, whatever you think of the deployment of the Guard to DC, it is being done against the will of the people of DC, and is kind of like indicative of the problems of not having control of their own affairs. Like the ability of Congress to like set the budget for Washington, DC is not great, like because people live there. And the framers of the Constitution did not anticipate that the capital district itself would become a massive city of 700,000 people. Right? They thought it was just like kind of a bunch of buildings and, like that's where Congress would meet and then everybody would go home to the real homes. And then it became a city, it became like a city. If you've spent any time in DC, every time I go to DC, I'm like, I don't understand why anybody settled here. It's really, really, really hot and I don't like it here at all. But it is a very significant city. So from a theoretical perspective, DC, I think a lot of people think DC should have representation, some kind of representation in Congress, and the only way to really do that is either to amend the Constitution to do that, or you can make DC a state by a simple act of Congress. Another thing I don't think is widely known, it's the bar to create states is not that high, right? Like simple majority in the House, simple majority in the Senate, the signature of the president, and some things that have to happen in the proposed state. But you can create a bunch of new states. My book has a proposal to divide California into 7 pieces, to 7 different states. Like there's a proposal to admit every ward in DC as a new state and have that, to use that to rewrite the US Constitution, like at will, basically. Like if you created, I think, 700 new states, because there's no requirement, like the Constitution doesn't say like, you need this many people to have a state. Or you need it to look like this, or it needs to be of a certain size. It doesn't say anything, right? So in theory, like every single person in this room could be their own state, according to a strict reading of the US Constitution. So anyway, there have been a number of significant pushes for DC statehood. The House of Representatives in 2021 passed a DC statehood bill that died in the US Senate by the filibuster. There are some, I don't have time to get into this, I think, but there are some constitutional objections to it that are actually quite serious. And the US, again, the current iteration of the Supreme Court, I happen to think is not super likely to agree that DC could be a state. That's, we don't really know because they haven't ruled on it. The last big push for DC statehood prior to 2021 took place in the early 1990s, and it just, it just didn't get there. So it may happen. And there's some Democratic partisans who want DC to be a state because it's like an 85 to 15 Democratic entity, and it would easily provide 2 extra Democratic senators. Right? I prefer to rest on the argument of representation representation. Like it's not fair to the people who live in DC to not having representation at all. I would certainly prefer that DC be part of Maryland or Virginia rather than having no representation at all. I think like either of those outcomes will be preferable to what we have now, which is like, do you want your state to, do you want the place that you live to be run directly by the US Congress? I don't, personally, okay? Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Well, David, thank you. See, I'm really loud with this. David, thank you so much for, yep, I'm in frame, for joining us this evening on behalf of the Schaumburg Library and, of course, the League of Women Voters of the Barrington, Palatine, I put those in the wrong order, Schaumburg area. You'll all forgive me later. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you all for coming out and spending your evening with us or logging in at home and spending your evening with us online. We will keep the Civic Awareness Party rolling in September. Typically, we're the fourth Tuesday of the month, but we're changing things up. Because I believe it would fall on Rosh Hashanah specifically. So we're going to move the Civic Awareness Series to Monday, September 29th. Same time, same location. You can still do it online or here at the library. And in September, going back to non-partisan sources, we're having Daily Herald editor Jim Slusher out, and he's going to talk about navigating the media and finding those reliable sources. So we hope to see you again Monday, September 29th, 7 to 8 p.m. You can register for that now. All of our fall programs at the library are live. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your evening and a safe drive home. Thanks so much.